Hello, everyone. Come closer. Welcome back to the darkness. I have a story for you tonight, a true story. And I need you to listen carefully, because this is the kind of tale that doesn't just want to be heard. It wants to be felt. It wants to crawl under your skin and make a home there. Before we begin our descent, do me a small favor and find that like button. Let it know you're here. And if you haven't already, subscribe. It's the only way I can keep unearthing these accounts from the shadows and bringing them into the light for all of you. Tonight, we continue our journey into the terrifying experiences sent in by viewers just like you. If you are carrying the weight of a story like this, a memory that haunts your waking moments, you can send it to the Gmail or the contact number you see on your screen right now. Don't carry it alone. All right. No more delays. The story I am about to share is a nightmare given form. It comes to us from a place that should have been full of life and promise a student rental house in Austin, Texas. But this story isn't just about a haunting. It's about a group of friends who were forced to become modern-day gravediggers and the secrets they unearthed along the way. The title alone sends a shiver down my spine. This account was sent in by a viewer named Adam, and he swears on his life that every single word is the God's honest truth, a crucible he and his friends were forced to walk through in their university days. Adam told me he couldn't bring himself to write this down until he had been out of that house for 3 solid months. He needed the distance. He needed to feel safe again. It all started when he was a junior. To save money, he and 3 friends rented a dilapidated old house in a cheaper, rougher part of East Austin. There were 4 of them crammed into a single room. It was an awkward space, with a small, rickety loft built into it. Adam shared that loft with his friend Leo, sleeping on thin mattresses just inches from the ceiling. Below them, on the main floor, were Logan and a friend named Henry. And it's Henry nearly every dark turn in this story. Every moment of suffocating dread pivots around Henry. At the time, Henry was the only one who had graduated. He was working full-time, while the others were still buried in textbooks. And this is where the haunting begins. With Henry, all alone in that silent house. It was late 2017. The city was glittering with Christmas lights, but the house was dark and empty. Adam and the others had all gone home for the holidays, leaving Henry behind to work until Christmas Eve. One night, after a grueling shift that had scraped him raw, he stumbled home, collapsed onto his mattress, and was dragged into sleep before he could even process the bone-deep exhaustion. But in that deepest, blackest part of the night, something pulled him back. It was a sharp, insistent tugging. He was dreaming, he thought, but the sensation was too real. It felt as though a pair of small, strong hands had reached out from underneath his mattress, seized the edge of his bedsheet at his feet, and were yanking it. Yank, yank, yank. A cold, chemical dread flooded his system, chasing away any hope of sleep. Annoyed, and more than a little creeped out, he sat bolt upright and slapped the switch on the cheap lamp beside his bed. The room flared into pale, sickly light. There was nothing. The air was still. The room was empty, with a shaky breath. He killed the light and tried to will himself back to sleep. He was just on the edge, that fragile space between waking and dreaming, when a crushing weight slammed down onto his chest. It was immense. A physical pressure that stole his breath and pinned his limbs to the mattress. He was paralyzed. His muscles were locked. His throat was sealed shut. But his eyes were wide open. He could see everything. and what he saw stopped his heart. Sitting at the foot of his bed, as serene and silent as a porcelain doll, was a little girl. She wore a simple, blood-red dress that seemed to drink the shadows in the room. Her hair was a fall of long, black silk, hanging down like a funeral veil, completely hiding her face. She just sat there, perfectly still. Her hands rested in her lap, but they were not idle. They moved in a delicate, repetitive weaving motion, her tiny fingers plucking and twisting invisible threads from the air, as if knitting a shroud from the suffocating silence itself. She made no sound, no whimper, no cry, just the sight of those small hands, weaving, weaving, weaving in the dark. Pure. Animal terror finally shattered his paralysis. With a strangled gasp, Henry threw himself sideways, his body moving on, pure adrenaline. He lunged for the main light switch on the wall, his fumbling fingers flipping every single switch up. The room was instantly bleached in a harsh, unforgiving glare. She was gone. Sleep was no longer an option. It was an impossibility. Shaking so violently his teeth chattered, Henry threw on his clothes and fled. He didn't stop running until he burst through the doors of a 24-hour convenience store, where he spent the rest of the night huddled under the fluorescent lights, nursing a single cup of coffee until the grey morning light finally broke the horizon. The next day, his company gave him a small gift basket of holiday sweets. That evening, returning to the house that now felt like a tomb, he didn't dare eat any of it. Instead, he painstakingly unwrapped the candies and the cookies and arranged them on a small plate. He placed the plate in the corner of the room where she had appeared, a desperate, pathetic offering to the thing that shared their home. It was useless. That night, the nightmare repeated itself. The paralysis, the crushing weight, and the little girl in the red dress, sitting at the foot of his bed, forever weaving her invisible thread. A week later, the holidays were over, and the house was full again. The first night they were all back together. Henry sat them down, his face pale and drawn. He told them everything. As he spoke, a palpable chill descended on the room, a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. And then, something strange happened. It was as if Henry's confession had broken a dam. One by one, the others began to speak. Their voices hushed, admitting for the first time that they, too, had seen things they couldn't explain. Logan went first. He confessed he would often hear the sound of dripping water right beside his mattress. Drip, drip, drip. A maddening, persistent sound, even though the wall next to him was solid, with no pipes, no plumbing, nothing but his worst experience. He said, happened one afternoon while he was cleaning. He saw a shadow move in his peripheral vision. When he turned, he saw it clearly, a dark silhouette, the unmistakable shape of a young girl, walking silently through the front door and gliding directly to the corner where Henry slept before vanishing into the wall. Then it was Adam's turn, the man who sent us this story. His voice was barely a whisper when he admitted that on his very first night in the house, sleep had refused to come. As he lay in the loft, staring into the oppressive darkness, he saw a shadow detach itself from the deeper shadows by the staircase. As his eyes adjusted, the form took shape. It was an old woman. Her face, he said, was a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. Her features twisted into a permanent snarl. Her mouth was moving without pause, her lips writhing as she muttered a constant stream of words. Then the muttering shifted. becoming a language he had never heard before. A series of harsh, guttural clicks and rasps that sounded like grinding bone. It felt like a curse, an incantation of pure malice being woven into the very fabric of the room. Terrified, Adam did the only thing he could think of. He yanked the blanket over his head and prayed for sleep to take him. Finally, Leo, the quietest of the four, spoke up. He told them about a night a few weeks before. A night when Head woken the entire room with a single blood-curdling scream. He had yelled, "Guys, they're running around in our room. They're all around us." The next morning, Leo had tried to explain. He said Head woken up, completely paralyzed, and had seen them, the small girl and the old woman. They were standing over his bed, looming over him in the darkness. But they weren't looking at him. They were looking at his head. Their ghostly, insubstantial hands were gripping either side of his skull, and they were slowly, methodically, turning it from side to side, back and forth, as if inspecting a piece of fruit. He was so paralyzed by terror that his mind had simply shut down. He blacked out, only waking up when he heard his own raw scream tearing through the silence. This was only the prelude. These were just glimpses into the abyss. The second part of this story is where the true nightmare begins. It centers on a secret Henry had been keeping from all of them, a side job that would end up dragging them all down into the cold, dark earth. You see, Henry had a part-time job Head never told them about. A few times a month, he assisted an older man in exhuming old, forgotten graves. He was, for a few hours a month and a bit of cash, a gravedigger. After that night of shared confessions, a thick cloud of fear hung over the house. They agreed they had to get out. They were ready to lose their security deposit, to just pack their things and run. But something held them there. Every attempt to find a new place failed spectacularly. Promising listings would be taken just minutes before they called. Landlords would suddenly change their minds. It was as if some unseen force had locked the doors from the outside, determined to keep them right where they were, defeated and on edge. They agreed to stick it out for one more month. A few days later, Adam, Leo, and Logan were in the kitchen making dinner when the front door opened. Henry walked in. He was caked in filth from head to toe, a thick layer of mud and grime covering his clothes and skin. He was carrying a large, heavy burlap sack over his shoulder, which he dropped onto the floor with a sickening, wet thud. When he opened it, they saw it was filled with heavy tools, shovels, pickaxes, and long, rust-pitted iron crowbars. At the time, they didn't think much of it. Henry's day job was in building maintenance. They just wrinkled their noses at the stench of damp earth and told him to go shower. When Henry emerged, clean but still looking haunted, he sat down at the table and began to eat with a terrifying, ravenous hunger. Adam swears he watched Henry inhale 5 full plates of food without saying a word. When he finally pushed the last plate away, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes dark and distant. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "I've got something to tell you guys." No one answered. Henry reached into his pocket and pulled something out, placing it on the table. It was a small, yellowed object, greasy to the touch, a single die, carved from bone. Seeing the strange relic, Adam forced a laugh. "What's that for? You bring that into my room when I am studying for finals. Maybe I can use it. Why are you carrying that thing around?" Henry's expression was dead serious. His eyes were like 2 black holes. "I just came from a job," he said. his voice a low whisper. We were digging up a body out by the I-35 interchange. This was buried with it. I thought it looked cool, so I took it. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. A wave of nausea rolled through Adam's stomach. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed. "Why in God's name would you bring that back here?" "I just thought it was neat," Henry mumbled, looking down at the die. "What's the big deal?" They ate the rest of the meal in a thick, suffocating silence. Later that night, the other three went out, needing to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house. They left Henry there, alone with his stolen treasure. When they returned late that night, the house was quiet. What they were about to experience, however, was a vision of such profound horror that it would be burned into their minds forever. Henry was already passed out on his mattress, clearly exhausted from his grim work. The others crept quietly to their beds, praying for a night of peace, as Adam lay in the darkness of the loft. He heard it, a faint, grating sound from downstairs. It was a dry, metallic scraping, like someone dragging the jagged edges of two steel rods against each other. Scrape! Scrape! It was quiet, but it was rhythmic, relentless. A sound that set his teeth on edge and made sleep impossible. After 10 minutes of the maddening sound, he tried to convince himself it was a mouse or the old house settling. But then he felt it. A low, powerful vibration started to travel up through the frame of the loft, making the entire structure tremble. In that instant, every nerve in his body screamed that something was terribly wrong. His heart hammering against his ribs, he slowly, cautiously, peered over the edge of the loft to the floor below, and his blood ran cold. Standing in the corner of the room was the old woman, the same one from his vision. She was wearing a traditional conical hat that plunged her face into absolute darkness. In her gnarled, shadowy hands, she held two of the long, iron crowbars from Henry's bag. She was rhythmically, hypnotically, striking the tips of the heavy bars against the wooden floor, again and again, creating the scraping, vibrating sound that had woken him from the edge of sleep. It was a ritual, a summons. Adam was paralyzed, not by a spirit, but by pure, undiluted terror. He was convinced that if he so much as breathed, she would look up. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not bear to see her face. He slowly, painstakingly, reached a trembling hand out and shook Leo. Leo's eyes snapped open. He didn't gasp, didn't make a sound. His gaze went immediately to the figure below. He had already seen her. He put a single finger to his lips, a silent, desperate plea for Adam to stay absolutely still. He had been lying awake, watching this horrifying tableau unfold for God knows how long. The two of them lay there, rigid, barely breathing, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, around 3 a.m., they heard the telltale sounds of their neighbors coming home from a late shift, a car door slamming, voices in the distance. The mundane noise seemed to break the spell when they dared to look down again. The corner was empty. The old woman was gone. The next morning, before the sun was even fully up, Adam and Leo scrambled down from the loft and went straight for Henry's sack of tools. They dumped its contents onto the floor. And there, buried beneath the heavy iron, was a bundle of old, tattered burial clothes, still caked with grave dirt and smelling of rot and damp earth. They immediately stormed over to Henry's mattress and shook him awake. "We're moving," Adam said. his voice shaking with rage and fear. Today, now. Henry's face was ashen, his eyes hollowed out from lack of sleep. He just nodded slowly. "I know," he whispered. "The woman from the grave, she came to me last night. She was furious. She wants her things back." He told them his mentor, the man who led the exhumations, had warned him never to take anything from a grave. He said, "These tools carry the spirits of the dead with them." Henry explained, his voice trembling, "I am taking them to my workshop. They're not staying here. And later, I am taking these clothes and that dye, and I am throwing them in the river." That's what he told me to do. He then told them the full, horrifying story of the previous day's dig, the house they'd been working at, the one by the interchange, had been built directly on top of an unmarked grave. The family living there had been cursed by a plague of misfortune. The husband was in prison, and their young child had been paralyzed in a freak accident. They hired Henry's mentor, a man named Mr. Silas, who was also a powerful psychic, to find the source of their torment. Mr. A. Silas had walked the property and immediately identified the problem, the unquiet, dead sleeping beneath their home. They had dug from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m. and found nothing. Henry, exhausted and furious, had finally slammed his crowbar into the earth in a fit of frustration. It didn't stop. It sank deep into the ground and hit something solid with a sickening thunk. They had found her. The skeleton of an old woman. After carefully cleaning the bones, mystified, Silas had taken them away for a proper reburial. But the tools, the clothes, and the bone dye that Henry had so foolishly stolen, they still carried the woman's rage. They carried her spirit. And the horror doesn't end there. It metastasizes. It follows them, moving from the haunted rental house to Henry's own family home in the countryside, a place where the dead had been waiting for a very long time. This part of the story, Adam said, was the most terrifying thing he has ever lived through. An experience so profound that he rarely, if ever, visited Henry's family at night again. Henry was a closed book when it came to his family. But one weekend, after their own haunting had reached a fever pitch, they were all drinking, trying to numb the fear. Henry, drunk and emotional, finally shattered his silence. "Guys," he slurred, his voice thick with a despair that cut through the alcohol. "I don't know what to do. There's something wrong at my parents' house." "What is it?" "Man," Logan asked, leaning forward. "Just tell us." Henry looked at them, and the fear in his eyes was ancient and raw. "My dad came home. He choked out, but I don't know if it was really my dad." Now, anyone else might have been confused by that, but they all knew. They all knew that Henry's father had been killed in a horrific car crash 3 years earlier. A sudden, violent silence fell over the room. Henry explained that his adopted older brother, a tough, pragmatic man who also claimed to be able to see spirits, had seen a figure sitting outside their family's front door. Night after night. It was the figure of a man in grey, his face and body a mangled ruin of blood and trauma. The apparition would just sit there, staring at the house, never moving, but unable to cross the threshold, held at bay by some unseen barrier. But that wasn't the only thing. His brother had also seen 3 other entities, thin, malevolent male spirits that lurked in the sprawling garden behind the house, always watching, always trying to find a way in. The family was living under siege. The root of the problem, Henry said, was their land. His family was devoutly Catholic, But their property, about 2.5 acres of rural Texas land, was riddled with old, unmarked graves because of their rigid faith. His grandparents strictly forbade any kind of offering or non-Christian ritual to appease the restless spirits of the land they lived on. Then, his mother broke her own long silence. She confessed that she had been tormented for years. At night, she would hear frantic scratching at the doors and windows. Disembodied voices would whisper her name from the darkness. The children in the family, his young nieces and nephews, would scream inconsolably. Every single night. She also revealed that the spirit of a young boy was attached to the large persimmon tree near their water cistern. He had appeared to her once, a pale, solemn child, and had delivered a chilling warning. If they ever dared to cut down his tree, he would come for them in the night and strangle them in their sleep. This sent a fresh wave of terror through Adam, because whenever they visited, they would sit and drink for hours under that very tree to escape the brutal Texas sun. The family was fractured by fear. Henry, his mother, and his brother were convinced they had to dig up the graves in the garden and give the spirits a proper, final burial somewhere else. His grandparents were appalled by the idea, insisting that prayer and their priest were the only answers. But Henry was stubborn. He took photos of the property and sent them to his mentor, Mr. Dew. Silas! The psychic's response was swift and grim. "Your house is filled with spirits," he told Henry over the phone. "The ground beneath your kitchen is the most active. There are at least 2 bodies buried there. And listen to me. Henry, do not go into your backyard after 6 p.m. That is when they are strongest. That is their time." And so, a plan was formed. A secret, desperate plan. With the grandparents vehemently opposed, they would have to do it under the cover of darkness, in the dead of night. Henry asked his friends for help. He couldn't face it alone, as Adam said. It wasn't even a question. They were brothers. You don't let your brother walk into the dark by himself. That weekend, they all piled into a 7-passenger van. Mr. Silas was behind the wheel, his face set like stone. In the back of the van, wrapped in burlap, was the same ominous collection of shovels and crowbars from the house on I-35. As they drove out of the city lights and into the swallowing darkness of the countryside, Adam felt a knot of pure dread tightening in his gut. They arrived at Henry's family home around 3:30 a.m. The property was drenched in an oppressive, unnatural blackness, broken only by a single, naked bulb burning on the porch. Henry's mother and brother were waiting for them, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. "Mr. Dom!" Silas wasted no time. "We have to be finished and gone before 6 a.m., he stated. Before the old ones wake, he produced a strange tool, like a brass divining rod, and began to walk the property. He would hold the tool over the ground, his eyes closed, then touch it to the forehead of Henry's mother, as if using her as a spiritual conduit. In this way, he located 2 distinct grave sites in the garden. As they gathered their tools, a chorus of furious barking erupted from all corners of the property. Mr. Silas ordered them to lock the family dogs in their kennels and throw thick blankets over them. "They cannot see this," he explained, his voice low and urgent. "The spirits will grow agitated. They will try to enter the animals." Before the first shovel broke the earth, Mr. Silas poured them each a shot of harsh whiskey to ward off the cold and the sickness of the grave, he said. He then had them rub a pungent, medicinal-smelling oil under their noses. It was so potent it made their skin burn. Then they began to dig. After an hour of backbreaking, Frantic work. A shovel struck something solid with a dull crack. They had found the first one. But as Mr. Silas peered down into the shallow grave, a string of curses escaped his lips. Damn it all! He spat. This one still got the pink threads. Adam leaned in, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He saw what Mr. Silas meant. The bones, yellowed and ancient, were covered in a fine, web-like substance, a sort of spectral mold. And in the beams of their flashlights, it glowed with a faint, sickly pinkish light. He didn't understand what it meant, but the look of grim disgust on Mr. Silas' face was enough. He would learn later that the pink threads were a type of powerful spiritual residue, a physical manifestation of a soul that was still violently, furiously attached to its earthly remains. Build a fire. Mr. End, Silas commanded. A big one. They scrambled to gather wood, dousing it in oil until a massive bonfire roared against the black sky. Mr. End. Silas then had them shovel the contaminated earth and the bone fragments directly into the heart of the inferno. A thick, acrid smoke boiled into the night, carrying a smell so foul and pungent it made them gag like damp earth after a rainstorm, but 1,000 times stronger, mixed with the smell of burning hair and something else, something ancient and wrong. After the fire had consumed everything, they shoveled the hot ash and charred fragments into a burlap sack. They moved to the second location, near the pig pen. But after another hour of desperate digging, they found nothing. The spirit was there, but the bones were long gone. Finally, they went to the persimmon tree. Mr. Silas did not dig. He simply approached the ancient tree and placed a handful of candy at the base of its trunk. A quiet, simple offering to the boy who slept among its roots. By the time they finished, the first hint of grey was touching the eastern sky. It was 6:05 a.m. They loaded the 2 sacks into the van and drove away, leaving the house and its secrets behind them in the twilight. About 15 miles down the road, Mr. Silas pulled over next to a deep, fast-flowing river. He told them to throw the sacks into the churning water. As the sacks hit the surface and were instantly swallowed by the current, Mr. Silas spoke, his voice low and solemn, almost a prayer. Death is not always the end, he said, staring into the black water. But to return to the river, that is the path of no return. From here, you can only move forward. Adam never fully understood the weight of those words, but he knew he had witnessed a final, powerful banishment. After that night, the suffocating presence at Henry's family home began to lift. The scratching at the windows ceased. The children began to sleep through the night, and the bloody, tormented apparition of Henry's father was never seen again. A few weeks later, the ancient persimmon tree, which had been healthy and strong for decades, suddenly shed all its leaves, withered, and died. The graves under the kitchen, however, remain undisturbed. Adam told Henry that if he ever decides to tear up his kitchen floor, he will not be there to help. But even with those spirits still sleeping beneath the house, he said a measure of peace has finally returned to Henry's family. A quiet that was paid for with whiskey, fire, and a secret buried in the dead of a Texas night. And that is where we must leave this story for tonight. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and join us again when we delve back into the darkness. Until then, I hope you all sleep well. Good night.